I really know nothing about fine art, but like, is a Picasso worthless because he used a third-party canvas? You know
Dude,
what I mean?
said that earlier.
On this podcast?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Well, there you go. Way
to pay attention, Gabe.
Shows how little I pay attention to Asher.
But yeah, I mean, the point is a valid one.
And so what are you...
Because I made it.
This is Open Work, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Riley, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Asher Rapkin, co-founder of Collective.
Collective is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California. We carry a wide range of independent brands, including Arcanaut, Singer Reimagined, James Lamb, and many, many more. To learn more about us and check out our available inventory, of course, visit collectivehorology.com.
Today on Open Work, we are going to discuss movements, how they are selected by watchmakers, the drama that can sometimes surround the ever-popular in-house versus mass-produced discussion, and we can offer some thoughts on how, why, or if movement design, finishing, and construction should figure into a purchasing decision. But first, Gabe, we have some news.
We do?
The weekend of October 18th to 20th is one of our favorite times of year. And that's true because it's when all of Collective packs up and heads to New York to participate in Worn & Wound's Wind Up Watch Fair. Now, this is going to be our 5th time sponsoring a Wind Up, and this year we will be there with watches for you to take home from Fears and Arcanaut, along with sample watches from Garrick to aid in your ordering decisions. We will also have some special and highly limited watches to share with you at the show, and we cannot wait to unveil those in the coming weeks. Now, we'll be there all 3 days from noon to 5 p.m. at the new venue, which is called Center 415, and it's conveniently located between 37th and 38th Street on 5th Avenue in Manhattan. This means that you're only going to be a couple of blocks away from Watch Time New York City, where our partner brands Czapek, Speak Marine, and Zeitwinkel will have all of their full lines on hand for you to try on. Finally, Wind Up is and always will be free and open to the public, but tickets are required for Watch Time, and you can buy those in advance now at watchtimeevents.com.
Is this episode sponsored by Wind Up and Watch Time?
This episode has no episode has ever been sponsored by anyone, actually, Gabe.
Yeah. Okay. No, but yeah, we're stoked. We love going to New York for this thing. And what I love about it is it's become something of a New York Watch Week where Wind Up and Watch Time have joined kind of forces to have both events both closer to each other. And that's really great because it's a good example of how the watch industry, while it is competitive, I think in a lot of great cases or in the best cases, it's nice to see when competitors acknowledge they're stronger together, and it's just better for everyone, and it attracts a crowd from across the country, which we love. So we're going to see so many people. We can't wait. But today, movements. Now, let's start with grounding ourselves in a couple of things. First, I think, is just some sort of industry context, like the current landscape of the movement industrial complex, because I think that's important for guiding our conversation. And then the second is some historical context that I think has really contributed not only to the state of that landscape, but a lot of the fixation on movement provenance, let's call it. So let's start with the landscape. So I've done some thinking, if you can believe that. I was up all weekend preparing for this.
Cleared the cobwebs out from inside your skull?
I did. For once in my life, I sat down and did some thinking. And here's what I sort of came up with. If I'm to look at the movement supplier landscape, I'm basically going to break it into 3 segments. That's scaled suppliers, premium suppliers, and in-house. And I want to say, while these are segments, it's really a continuum or a spectrum, which we'll cover in a second. So let's start with the scaled suppliers. And these are companies like ETA, Solido, Le Joux Perret, Soprod, Miyota, and so forth. These are companies that supply movements at scale to brands across the industry. That could be everyone from your favorite micro brand to, a major brand name manufacturer. We know these movements quite well. And these are businesses that are making thousands of movements a year. Probably, I don't know, I'm going to guess maybe even close to 1 million movements a year across all of them.
Yeah, and they also provide movements at different levels of finish.
Yes.
So you can purchase from, and it varies from different companies, but say, let's look at Solida. You can purchase different grade movements from Solida, and that means different levels of finishing, different levels of customization. starting with relatively raw movements. When I say raw, I mean unfinished, all the way up to rather nicely machine decorated movements. So there's a wide range even within, as Gabe mentioned, the subspectrum of scaled suppliers.
Yeah, exactly. And most brands that you're thinking about or familiar with will probably have some level of customization done, whether that's their own rotor. That tends to be kind of one of the more common things. There might even be some special finishing or engraving, things like that. So there's a level of customization that's possible, but it comes with a certain level of scale. So people who are doing customizations like that are putting in large orders from these folks. That's why we're calling them scaled suppliers. Now, when you mention the customization, that sort of bleeds into that next segment, which I'm calling the premium suppliers. I don't know if that's like, it's premium is a loaded term, but they're able to provide a whole nother level of customization above and beyond what Sellita, ETA, Le Jouperet, and so forth will do. And these are companies like Chronode, Le Cirque des Horlogers, Schwarz Etienne. These are folks that are making movements that are generally a bit more complicated in their architecture. They're generally at a higher level of finishing. And they offer a level of customization to the brands who do business with them, all the way up to totally white labeling them. But they offer a level of customization that, say, these suppliers like ETA and Sellita don't. So now they may offer, Schwarz Etienne, I think, is a good example. You'll see Schwarz Etienne movements in a lot of really interesting watches. So like Ming, for instance, uses Schwarz Etienne movements. I believe, did Havid Nagan use Schwarz Etienne? Yeah. So you look at these movements and they're really nice. They're well finished. They have an interesting architecture, micro rotors in the case of Schwarz Etienne. So these are sort of at a quote unquote higher level of kind of engineering and finishing. But these companies will also completely white label movements. So Chronode is an interesting example. So Czapek's movement, the SS oh, this old chestnut. The SXH-5, which is in the Antarctique, is a movement that was designed and engineered by Czapek, but is produced by Chronode. So it's sort of this hybrid, right, of like an in-house movement because it's a design that is proprietary to Czapek and developed by Czapek, but the means of production come from Chronode. They produce this movement for them.
I think the simplest way to think about it is when you go to what we're calling a premium supplier, they're not just offering and I don't want to have a negative connotation here, but it's not just like an off the shelf, if you will, caliber. They're willing to do significant engineering work for you to develop a caliber that is distinct to your company, which, by the way, is something we'll get to in a minute about where the lines get blurred between what is an in-house movement versus not and how you choose to define it. But suffice to say, you'll find that from manufacturers like Le Cirque du Horloger for sure, from Chronode for sure. And then throughout this range of the spectrum, there are also folks that are doing various different ranges of finishing work, component manufacture, and things like that are part of the larger supply chain versus, say, purchasing a Sellita SW200 series or 300 series movement, which is essentially a complete package that's delivered to you with whatever modest amount of customization is available at that time.
Yeah, and I think this is an important point to underline. There are watch brands out there who market themselves as having in-house movements, who are in fact using suppliers like Le Cirque des Horlogers or Chronode to white label manufacture that movement for them. So we're not going to name names or things like that here, but that leads into our third sort of segment, which is in-house. And when I say in-house, I mean completely in-house, where the movement is designed and manufactured almost entirely by, if not entirely, by the brand. So this would be Rolex, this would be Seiko, and this would even include some smaller brands. So a good example of this would be J.N. Shapiro, the movement in the Resurgence. He's making everything in that movement with the exception of the mainspring and the rubies, but everything else is made in-house by Josh. Even hairspring is done in-house. Armin Strom is another really interesting example. Now, again, they may get some particular parts or components for their movements, but it's like 95% of the components in their movements are developed and produced.
95% by weight, Gabe?
Yeah, just like 95% of the stuff in the movement. And so I think the bar here for in-house is quite high. Now, running across these three segments is an interesting ripple, which is a lot of the major holding groups will actually have these capabilities in-house at the group level. So, of course, ETA is part of the Swatch Group, and ETA provides movements not just to brands outside the Swatch Group, but within the Swatch Group that are heavily modified. The Powermatic movements are a good example. Richemont has this as well. They have their own movement manufacturer, Val Fleurier. And so a lot of the movements you see, for instance, in IWC watches are produced in-house by Val Fleurier for IWC to IWC specifications.
Oh, it's not just IWC. It's
sure.
Vacheron Constantin in some cases. It's Panerai. It's throughout the entire portfolio.
Yes. So, it's hard to segment this out, but needless to say, like, there are options from scaled to more custom to in-house, and that's kind of the landscape. Now, the other thing I want to just round out this landscape with is a little bit of historical context for how we even got to this landscape, and also in particular the focus on movements and movement provenance, whether it's in-house or whatever it might be. And I think a key moment in time was 2007. So I'm going to lay out kind of three things here. In 2007, Swatch Group announced that ETA was going to cut off supply to the rest of the industry, meaning any brand outside of the Swatch Group would no longer have access to ETA movements by 2010. Now, this didn't really come to be. One, I believe the Swiss government actually kind of got involved because, as you can imagine, the watch industry was like, you're giving us 3 years. And in the watch industry, as we've talked about many times, 3 years is like the blink of an eye when you think about what's required to do something like, say, produce a movement. So this didn't end up happening, and I don't honestly know whether Swatch Group and ETA ever did sort of dial down the number of movements they were supplying to the industry more broadly. But suffice it to say, that announcement, whether it came to pass or not, or to what extent it came to pass, was a shot across the bow. And it was a wake-up call to the rest of the industry who were reliant on ETA. And let's remember, some big brands outside of Swatch Group were very reliant on ETA. Tudor would be a good example. IWC, which we were just talking about, a lot of its movements were supplied.
Omega. Even though that's Swatch
Group, by ETA, but sure, Omega as well. So they were, of course, a major supplier, and this led to a couple of things. One, the ascent of Sellita. This really put wind at Sellita's back because they're not owned, I don't believe, by one of the major holding companies, and so they sort of became a neutral supplier. A lot of their movements were plug and play with ETA movements. So in other words, if your whole production line was built on using like a 2824, you could drop in the equivalent Sellita movement into that case.
One of my favorite fun facts about Sellita is that it is actually wholly owned and independent. So Sellita is actually an independent.
Well, that's pretty cool. I did not know that.
Yeah, isn't that neat?
So this led to the growth of Sellita, and then also some of the other brands we mentioned, Le Jeu Perret. This has helped Soprod as well. So I think that was something that was important. It also led a number of brands to say, we need to start making our own movements, and we need to go in-house more, and in order to do that, obviously they had to make significant investments. And so this created what I think was a new day of like emphasis on in-house from a marketing standpoint from the brands. Not only did it become a necessity for them, but then it became something they used as like a marketing proof point.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good insight that you're making there, because, and this is something that I think Hodinkee has even publicly taken some responsibility for, which is the fact that they have championed or there is a general belief, I should say, that because something is quote unquote manufactured in-house, that it is materially better than something that was mass produced. Now, I can hear like pitchforks being sharpened.
I don't think it's fair to say that Hodinkee. I mean, there's plenty of
watch
stuff.
Media in general, I would say.
There's also plenty of thoughtful coverage from Watch Media about the virtues of not in-house movements and things like that. But I think what happened was in-house. And we're talking about brands like, again, IWC, Panerai, and so forth. In-house became a PR talking point that then bled into a lot of the media coverage and discourse. That's for sure.
Yeah, and the perceived value of something.
Yeah.
I certainly can recall earlier on in my own personal collecting, that one of the first questions you'd ask when you walked into a store is like, oh, does this watch have an in-house movement? even though, as we'll get into it, there are incredible pieces of art to be found with in-house movements and calibers. And then there's also incredible value, not just financially, but long-term security in mass-produced and movements. And also, as we'll also talk about, the real contribution to creativity that mass-produced movements have given to the market. So before we even get much further, I do want to specify, we're not going to, at any point in this pod, tell you that one type of movement is better than another.
Nope.
But what I think we've come to learn, both as people who love watches, buy them ourselves and collect them ourselves, and also sell watches and constantly have this conversation, is that movements, whether they are, somewhere on this spectrum and where they sit on that spectrum, definitely has a major impact on someone's purchase decision, and therefore has a major impact on the way that brands are often marketing their product and their movements to those consumers to attempt to impact
and the way they're
decisions.
covered, because watch media wants to cover things in a way that's meaningful to collectors. So I think that was the second point. So the first point was the historical context here is 2007 ETA makes this announcement, which really changes things. The second kind of force here has been collector demand. But that's really been driven, I think, by brand marketing. In-house is put out there as a proof point, as we talked about, and watch media. So, in-house kind of entered the lexicon in a way that it wasn't persistent before. And then the third sort of macro trend here, or underlying driver behind all of this, I think, is the democratization, or the relative democratization, of the means of engineering and production. And so what I'm talking about here is, obviously, we've undergone a technological revolution in the last 20 years, to say the least, when it comes to things like computer-assisted software for doing this sort of stuff. The accessibility of means of production like CNC machines, automatic lathes continue to get better and less expensive. There are more people trained on how to use these things. 3D printing. Now, obviously, movements aren't 3D printed, but prototypes are. And 3D printing really allows smaller producers to experiment, to try things, and to figure things out. So there's been a democratization of the means of production that has gone along with all of this. And I think all of these things taken together have created these tailwinds for in-house, whatever that means, in-house, or even these premium suppliers. It's now more efficient to make a more customized or a white label movement for a brand than it was 15, 20 years ago. So all these things have kind of worked together to create that landscape we're in now.
So let's work our way through this spectrum and talk about what we think the most interesting components are, and ways that we would suggest that somebody consider why or why not to invest in a product that features a movement on this point of the continuum. So let's start in the beginning with scaled manufacturers. And I'm going to preface, I'm going to remove from the conversation of scaled manufacturers technical interest. So what I mean by that is, I fully recognize we're all watch nerds, and the details are what make, in many ways, a watch interesting to us. But for the purpose of this conversation, I'm going to remove things like power reserve, various different types of chronograph mechanisms, et cetera, on this lower end of this beginning entry of the spectrum, because I really want to focus on two things which I think often get eclipsed when somebody is considering a watch that features, say, an SW200 or 300, a Valjoux 750, something in that range, 7750, excuse me. Let's start with the two things that I think I consider. And by the way, I'm going to preface by saying it took me a long time to get to this place, but I really think that there's two values when we look at mass-produced movements, and that's serviceability and creativity. So the first is
creativity.
Yeah,
Ooh,
creativity.
Go on.
So the serviceability thing, I don't think we need to dwell on this, but I can't reiterate it enough, especially in independent watches. One main concern that we often hear people bring up is, what will happen if this company isn't around in 15 or 20 years? Now, obviously, we don't want that to be the case. We want everyone to be around forever, but it's not a crazy question when you're spending thousands of dollars on something. And when you have a watch that's powered by an ETA, a Sellita, a Landeron, what have you movement, you can feel very confident that the parts for those movements and the know-how for those movements and the technical drawings for those movements are readily available, and that most watchmakers have at one point or another spent time messing around with a 2824 or a Valjoux 7750 or, Soprod A10 or like whatever. Like these are all movements that are highly, highly, highly familiar to watchmakers, relatively affordable and easy to repair. So there's a lot of like sometimes I think nose turning at these sorts of things like, oh, well, they're so common. And my response to that would be like, well, yeah, like that's good. The fact that these watches are common and so readily available means that spare parts are readily available, knowledge is readily available, and that you can probably find a local watchmaker to support with the work to repair and regulate those watches, as opposed to sending them back to a large corporation and paying a high fee for that same work.
Exactly. One of the objections we often get to, I mean, there's objections, right? There's benefits and there's objections to every kind of movement. But one of the objections we often get with some of the brands we carry who are in-house or have highly proprietary movements is concerns around, one, cost, because the less scale you have, the more proprietary something is, generally the more expensive it is to repair it because the parts are just fewer and farther between. They're more proprietary. Each part costs more to repair. There's also fewer people who can do it. And in a lot of cases, that means it's not only more expensive, but it's got to go all the way back to Switzerland. And shipping watches across borders, even for servicing, is a nightmare. Watches are obviously, in many cases, very high-valued goods, and they tend to get scrutinized at the border, both in the United States, where we are, but even in Switzerland. And we have nightmare stories of watches getting held up by customs in various countries. Now, they ultimately get through, but when a watch shows up and customs sees it's declared for nothing because it's going to be serviced and there's a way to declare all that, it tends to raise hackle. So suffice it to say, it's a real benefit to know that not only is your watch going to be relatively easy to service and not crazy expensive, but that you can do it domestically. I think that's a huge benefit.
100%. I think that leads to the second point around these movements, which is, I would argue that in many ways they are one of the greatest engines for creativity in the watchmaking world today. And what I mean by that is, if you go to the Wind Up Watch Fair, for example, and you walk through that space and you look at the 100+ brands that are there, one thing that will be common, despite the fact that all of them may look significantly different from one another, may have different features, may have completely different form factors, there will be a commonality of movement throughout those watches.
Yeah, so like let's just run the numbers here. There are 120-ish, I think, brands that are going to be exhibiting at Wind Up New York, which we were just talking about. How many movement suppliers do you think are represented across those 120 brands?
Less than 5.
Yeah, okay, so there you go.
Yeah, and I think, and even within those less than 5, there's probably limited variability in terms of the calibers that are there. Now, you can look at that cynically and say, ugh, that's so depressing that all these watch brands use the same movement. But I would argue that 120 watch brands might not exist but for those movements. Yeah. So when we look down at our wrists and we see an Anordain Model 3, or we look at our wrist and we see, a watch from Lorca or what have you, those brands could not exist straight up without Sellita. And I think that that's absolutely beautiful. And not only could they not exist, if they did exist, they would cost 4 or 5 times more because of the bespoke nature of movement production. And one would say, if the purpose of a lot of those watches is design driven, certainly the case with, say, Anordain, would increasing the price by 4 or 5x provide 4 to 5 times more value and enjoyment for the watch? That's a rhetorical question only you, the listener, can answer. But I think it's reasonable to say that it's a phenomenal gift to the watchmaking bit industry and the collecting community as a whole to be able to have these scaled manufacturers so that we can have something like a beautiful enamel dial on our wrist for under $10,000.
Yeah. This is you did this to me, so now I'm going to do it to you. I'm going to steal one of your famous lines and something that you've said to me many times, which is, when you're evaluating a watch, and you're making a decision, which is a very personal decision about whether not only do you like it, but if you even want to buy it, the question is, where do you find value in the watch? And so let's take an example of some of the brands that we're talking about here. Where do you find value in an Anordain watch, for instance? For me, it's the absolutely heartbreakingly beautiful enamel dials. For me, with Anordain, fundamentally, the value is in the craft of those dials.
Okay. So before we move on to the next part of the spectrum, you just put something out there that I think is really important to address, which is this general comment that does tend to come up, and I see it in watch groups. I'm not going to pretend that I was above it, in the earlier parts of my collecting too, which is, wait a minute, these are mass produced, right, Gabe? And if they're mass produced, how expensive are they? Well, let me go Google that. And you find out that a Sellita, let's say an SW200, 300 series, costs somewhere between $200, $300 for the movement. Now, this creates, I think, a really weird dynamic because people often then say that is a lot of money for a watch with a fill in the blank movement. Now, far be it from me or anyone to tell you what too much or too little, value you can find in something at whatever price point. But I will argue that watches, like so many of the things we use every day, cars, computers, whatever, are more than the sum of their parts. And when I go back to that point about Sellita and Landeron, ETA, and all these different brands and manufacturers being engines of creativity, part of that is because the components are affordable enough for a smaller brand to be able to start using them and then scale with them as they grow. And of course, built into the price of a watch isn't just the raw material, the movement, and the rest. It's also the compensation for the people and the teams that spent all their time developing that product entirely on spec, unpaid, until it was finally ready to deliver. So I think that when people start saying, like, because it has, a certain movement in it, the watch can only reasonably exist in a certain window of pricing, may not be a fair way to evaluate a watch, because it essentially diminishes that watch into nothing but its parts, in which case the finest masterpieces and hanging in a museum should only really be worth the cost of the paint.
I think the best example of this that we have is James Lamb watches. So James Lamb, British watchmaker, essentially everything in that movement is handmade and or made by artisans in the UK, with the exception of the movement, which is a manual wind Sellita movement. This is a brand we brought with us to wind up, I think last year, a couple of years ago. And it was on the table with watches from the other brands we carry. And more often than not, as people would approach the table, they would be seeing this watch and others on our table for the first time, which is great. That's the point of wind up. And the question we get from most people is, first question, what kind of movement's in there? Before there's any question about who is this watchmaker, what am I looking at, what's interesting about this watch, the question is, what's the movement in this watch? And the assumption there is the most valuable asset of this watch is the movement. Now, in the case of James,
I think it also helps people price anchor.
Well, sure.
Right, because if you walk up to a watch that looks as beautiful as a James Lamb, and you say what movement is in there, and I say, oh, it's a completely in-house movement, then you might reasonably assume that it's significantly more expensive than it is. And vice versa. Now,
a James Lamb watch is about $9,000, $8,900.
An Origin series.
Yes, the Origin series, the watch we're talking about here, is $8,900 as of the time of this recording. And if you were to just purely reduce the watch based on what you're saying there to, what is the ballpark cost of this thing? In my mind, what is the ballpark cost of this thing based on the movement used? It's a lot of money for a Sellita movement, which is the response that we would get from a lot of people. However, the value in a James Lamb watch is not in the movement. It's essentially in everything else. In particular, the case of that movement is entirely handmade by James.
The case of that watch.
Sorry, the case of that watch is entirely, the movement episode's got me all wrapped around a pole. The value in that watch is really based on on the case. And the case is made of silver. It's entirely hand hammered by James. It never touches a CNC machine. It also has a beautiful cloisonné enamel dial. Everything else, like I said, in that watch is handmade in the UK. So the movement isn't really what drives the value of that watch, and I don't think is the thing that should be used to determine the value of that watch.
No, and once again, that watch could not exist but for that Sellita movement.
Well, what do you think? I mean, if James was capable or interested in making an in-house movement, what do you think a watch like that would cost?
I don't want to box him in.
Sure,
but many factors higher.
Many times
well over
higher.
$50,000.
Sure. For context, a J.N. Shapiro watch. This is a guy who's making how many watches?
35.
Josh making a year? 35 watches a year with in-house movements, starting in stainless steel, $70,000. So that should give you a sense of how much more that watch would cost if not for the movement. So in that case, the movement is not a liability, but instead a gift.
So let's move over now into the premium supplier part of the spectrum, because in many ways, there's a lot of really fascinating stuff going on over here, and it's not relegated anymore to the like $50,000 plus world exclusively.
We mentioned Havid Nagan and Ming at the top of this episode, and these are businesses that just wouldn't have been really possible 20 years ago. This segment of the industry, I think, has benefited the most from the democratization of technology.
Yeah, and we're even seeing that with Chronode. Chronode previously was largely making movements for watches that were $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 plus. We're seeing them now in L'Aventure watches, for example, for around $10K. Right. A little bit less, actually, I even think, for the base caliber in the diver, a little bit more for the chronograph, but that's a highly limited production movement for in a chronograph, which is a notoriously difficult movement to design, or style of movement to design, at a relatively compelling price point. I think those, when they retailed, came out like €9,000 or 9,000 Swiss francs, like not crazy at all for what you were getting from them.
There's a few other good examples. Another good one would be Trilobe. I think they use Le Cirque des Horlogers calibers in their stuff as well.
And I think there's a couple of interesting things that are happening in this space, right? So in this space, when you go as a watchmaker to these brands, to these manufacturers, you're not looking at these base calibers. You're really saying to them, well, that's not entirely true. For Chronode, for example, I believe they now have a base caliber. Certainly Vaucher has a base caliber. Schwarz Etienne has base calibers, but not all of them do. And a lot of the work that some of these guys do, especially Chronode in particular, certainly Le Cirque du Horloger, is that in addition to having the prowess on the old world style here, so I'm talking, or old world component of the business, I'm talking about like actual hand finishing of components and things like that. They also have engineering prowess, which means that you can contract them to work with you to make a movement. Now, I want to pause here because this is really important. In every industry in the world, I imagine, certainly the industries I've worked in television, I've worked in film, I've worked in tech.
You worked inside a television?
I was locked in a TV. But I'll give you an example. When I worked at MTV, many of the shows that we would put on air on MTV were not produced by MTV. They were produced by external production companies, which were hired by MTV, or the content was licensed from those production companies, and then was aired as an MTV television show. And this is true. Like, I assure you, many of the shows that you see on Netflix today, for example, were not made by Netflix. They were outsourced.
I don't know that any of them are. I mean, Netflix obviously will fund things and have proprietary productions, but the actual work of making, I think from folks I know who've worked on these things, almost every show on Netflix is done by a third-party production company.
But this is my point, right? Which is that oftentimes expertise is hired out to the people that are experts in that space. So if you are somebody who specializes in movement design and engineering, you probably have a company, whether it's Chronode or even someone Chronode contracts with, to do that work, to make sure that the work is done right before you move into the incredibly expensive and laborious portion of prototyping it, manufacturing it, and actually delivering a finished product. The thing about this is, and I think it gets a little murky when people say, is it fully in-house? It's like, well, what does that really mean? Does it mean the way that we think of modern Rolex or Seiko, for example, where virtually, or Josh Shapiro on the higher end of the spectrum?
Well, Seiko is a good example. They're doing everything from literally growing their own quartz crystals to making their own lubricants. So even like the synthetic lubricants that are used in the watch aren't bought from another supplier. Seiko manufactures them.
Sure.
It's a level of like insanity and quite impressive if you think about it.
But the point that I'm making there isn't just that Seiko is impressive. It's just that bar is so incredibly high that there's really only two companies that I can think of, Seiko and Rolex, that do that.
I don't even know that Rolex meets Seiko's bar. And part of the reason why is because the Japanese watch industry almost exists in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Whereas
Good point.
Whereas the Swiss watch industry is much more robust and there are suppliers. I don't know what Rolex actually gets from third-party suppliers versus makes them. I don't know if they make their own lubricants or anything. I have no idea. But suffice it to say, the bar is extraordinarily high. And in the case of Seiko's, it is a function of necessity.
But this is my point. If the bar is that high, when people talk about in-house, to me that says, was the watch conceived by the company, carried through to its completion by the company, and is there work being done on those watches? Is more work being done on those watches than not inside the walls of the company? So if you think about it, like,
or would that thing exist but for that company? So in the case of like Czapek's SXH5, I got it that time, SXH5, don't try it a second time, movement. Yes, it's made by Chronode or produced by Chronode, but it would not.
It's manufactured by Chronode.
Manufactured by Chronode. That's what I mean. But it would not exist if not for Czapek.
Exactly. And it's still finished to an extraordinarily high degree. It is assembled by Czapek. There is a lot of work that is being done by Czapek. But Chronode is their supplier.
Yeah, and it's interesting. One of the gripes, and
for that caliber,
I think this is. I can see why. I don't really care about this, but I can see why people do. One of the gripes against those scaled movements, like ETAs, Solitas, and so forth, is they come in generally like a 2824 comes in one size. And to get it to fit in your watch is either a certain size or you use a movement spacer to get it to fit within the case. One gripe about those has always been like, well, I don't like looking if a movement has an exhibition case back at the reverse side of one of these watches because the movement doesn't fill the case. And when you take these premium suppliers, they can make for you a movement that fills the case of your watch and was purpose built specifically for the watch itself, which to me meets like this really high bar and completes, this aesthetic ideal of a watch.
Yeah, but it also locks out clients that aren't able to pay $10,000, $15,000 or $20,000.
Yes.
Or significantly more. So, I do think and this goes back to my earlier point about like movements that are mass produced being an important component of the ecosystem. I don't know that I would have been able to afford to get into watch collecting prior to, I don't know, well, just full stop. I don't know that I would have been able to, because I would have been terrified to spend, let alone didn't have, $10,000, $20,000 or what have you, to buy into a movement that met that bar at the time that I started getting interested in watches 20 years ago.
Well, I would also imagine that some of the folks who work at places like Chronode, we keep talking about, I would imagine there's someone at Chronode who probably came from a company like ETA or Solita, right? So not only would you have not been able to get into watches if it weren't for those more scaled things, there wouldn't be a movement industry in Switzerland cultivating the talent. So that's everything from, someone who is finishing a movement or QCing a movement to an engineer who is working in software and literally doing math to figure this stuff out and prototyping. Like I would imagine doing math stuff. I would imagine, obviously there are some skills which are really going to be kind of proprietary to the high end of the movement industry, like a certain level of hand finishing. You're not going to get that person who from ETA or Solita or Soprod or wherever else. But I would imagine a lot of the back end stuff, like the engineering, people who are trained on the software, people who are trained on CNC machines, things like that. The industry benefits from having those scaled suppliers, because that creates talent for the high end and in some ways kind of subsidizes and makes possible the high end as well.
Yeah. So let's talk about the high end in a moment, but then I want to take a step back because we've been talking about this stuff devoid of, I think, to a certain degree, emotion, which is a critical component of evaluating these sorts of things. And there's a romanticism to movements. And frankly, there's an entire world from a creative, artistic, and I think just overall aesthetic evaluation of these watches that we need to like really address here. But let's first just talk about what it actually takes to make an in-house movement. So there's a lot that gets thrown around. It takes at least $1 million to make a movement, this, that, and the other thing. All right. Well, at the very highest order, aside from having the finalized design of a watch that you're making, you need to not just make the actual technical design of a movement, you also need to think about it from an aesthetic standpoint. Because when you think about an in-house movement, not only does it need to meet the technical bar, it also has to be, well, should be beautiful. And it should be a cohesive, considered continuation of the design of the watch. A perfect example of this is Dennis Flageolet and De Bethune. De Bethune movements are a absolute perfect continuation of the idea of the watch through to its technical implementation. It's part of what makes him so remarkable, hype aside. And that is, to me, from an aesthetic standpoint, part of what is so appealing about being fully in-house. Not that it is by nature fully in-house, but because it gives the artist, it gives the watchmaker the ability to truly have a complete thought.
Yeah, a complete thought watch. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think when I boil it down, like that's really the value, right? Like when you buy a watch from Philippe Dufour, from
you're buying the platonic ideal of that watch. Nothing has been compromised.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think, and by the way, that platonic ideal can exist in the middle of the spectrum. And it can also exist at the lower end of the spectrum too, depending on what you're trying to achieve with the watch. But if what you are trying to make, if you're, a Sylvain Pinot, if you are a Recep Rezepi or whatever, if what you're trying to do is have a complete overarching concept perfectly executed with no compromise, price like not even considered, an in-house movement can really do that for you. And I want to add too, as we mentioned, just because a movement is completely in-house, quote unquote, doesn't mean that it is made 100% within the walls of that facility. There are suppliers providing components. And the reason why is that it doesn't make sense in many cases for a manufacturer of a watch manufacturer to invest what it costs in some portion of the movement manufacture process if they can outsource it just as efficiently. I'll give you an example. Making screws, right? Let's say you don't have that's
a brilliant example.
Yeah, like an automatic lathe to make the raw, and I'm talking about like raw screws. These things don't come out of the machine ready to be screwed into the watch movement.
Insert a steel bar, press a button, and get a screw.
No. So those lathes are really expensive. The know-how is expensive. There are hourly employees that work that are expensive to do all of that. It may not make sense for a watchmaker to invest the time, the energy, the effort, and the training, the equipment, etc., just to make screws. Now, it may make a lot of sense for them to then get those screws from a third party, to glue them themselves, to polish them themselves, to finish them themselves, and of course, to assemble them themselves. But the question to you as the consumer is, would you rather pay another I'm making it up, like $3,000 per watch just to know that the screw came out of a machine in the facility of that watchmaker versus down the road from another guy who just makes a lot of screws for other watchmakers? I mean, it's a rhetorical question, but I think it's an important one. It's the same thing when someone says, and I remember this, I remember asking a certain watchmaker who says that his movement is based off of an ETA 2824, and it's a $20,000 watch. And I asked that watchmaker, well, how much of the 2824 are you using? And he said, I just use the base plate. And I was like, you just use the base plate? He's like, yeah, everything else we manufacture ourselves. And I thought, like, all right, well, first of all, I guess that's an incredible act of transparency. But on the other hand, most collectors would probably be like, oh, that's it? Really? Because for that person, like, to have the CNC machine.
Essentially, the base plate is a component he's buying from ETA, but he can't buy it as a component. And so they just buy the full kit. Interesting.
And the question then becomes like, do we want to like claim he's not quote unquote in-house because he got that part from them because it doesn't make any financial sense to manufacture that base plate himself within the walls of the company because it would cause the cost of that product to go up so significantly for something that is essentially immaterial to, well, not immaterial, that's not fair, but is not, where it came from doesn't necessarily impact the watch's functionality in any way, shape, or form, or even in this case, it's aesthetics. Yeah. So I think when we look at this sort of thing, it's important to say to ourselves, and there are some companies that have really suffered because they were quote unquote exposed for using, components manufactured by third parties in their in-house movements. And like, there's part of me that says, look, what you say matters and how you position things matters. But then the flip side of that is like, but does it really? And I think if the idea is fully executed and the movement has been designed and so particular to your watch, and as you pointed out earlier, it is the no holes barred, like complete expression of it. And just because a part came from a third party or another engineer at another firm helped design it, does that diminish that watchmaker's ability? I would say no, in my opinion. Because if you look at it in other industries, there are plenty of people who bring in subject matter experts to help them get something done. And I bet if you, dear listener, think about it, you probably do this on a day-to-day basis too, but it doesn't diminish your expertise in that field. So it comes around, I think, just this point of where do we not only find the value in a watch, but where do we want to judge a watch company? And really, what are we getting at when we do that? Now, putting that aside for a minute, there is a component of all this which we haven't touched on, and that is a whole other world of conversation, and that's finishing. Because we've been talking about movement manufacture, and we sort of mentioned finishing.
But not really.
Really. Now, finishing is something where I do see a tremendous amount of value. Because finishing, especially when I'm talking about hand finishing here, not machine finishing. Finishing done by hand does require man hours, skill, practice. There's a lot that goes into being somebody who works at the highest echelon of movement finishing. And there is value in that. Whether it's a heavily finished Unitas movement, we have watches, for example, that we retail from Garrick, which use some Unitas-based calibers, but they are finished to such an extraordinarily high degree by the watchmakers inside of Garrick. I would argue that the cost of the movement is essentially immaterial against the value that
relative to the handwork.
Correct. Yeah. The value that's then injected into that watch through the handwork.
And I think in that case, it's interesting. The movement on the Garrick, in this case, the movement there is essentially a canvas for the hand finishing and the handwork of the maker. Now, Garrick does make in-house movements, which are many times more expensive and are also a canvas for their finishing. But if what is attractive to you and what's appealing to you is the romance and the skill of the hand finishing and the hand engraving and the finishing that goes into a Garrick movement, and that's what you want, well, guess what? If you go with one of their watches like the S6, which is a Unitas powered watch, you can get all of that hand finishing for a fraction of the price of what their in-house movements cost. So depends on what you value, right? And there are people who may value their Garrick's in-house movements who really aren't so interested in the hand finishing and more like, I really like what Garrick has done with their deadbeat movement, for instance. And so it just becomes a question of what you want. But I think if what you want is, plug for Garrick here, if what you want is a beautifully hand-finished movement, their Unitas-based watches represent an extreme value.
So I think this goes to that larger point of when you're looking at a movement or considering it in a watch, what matters to you? And I would say, for example, if you pick up a watch at wind up and you look at it,
what fundamentally attracts you to that watch?
Yes, exactly. So if you pick up a watch at wind up and you say, this watch is beautiful. In every way, it's something I would love to wear, but I wish it had an in-house movement. Then the question that might be worth asking yourself is, why? Because it might not be the watch you're looking for. If you pick something up and you say, this is perfect in every way except for this movement, maybe what you're looking for is a watch with an in-house movement that provides you the aesthetics of hand finishing. That is a more comprehensive thought. But the thing is, it's probably not going to be at that price point. And similarly, if you pick up that same watch You look at it, you're like, this watch is amazing, but it has a Sellita movement in it. I don't know that it's worth it. This goes back to our point earlier that Gabe stole from me about like fine art being worth only the canvas and the oil paint that was used for it. Well, that's not how we evaluate art. Why is it how we evaluate watches? How come fine art is considered artistic and aspirational, but watches are considered money grabs?
I think your point is a good one, which is a lot of the conversation I've seen in watch media on this topic has lectured people about why they are wrong to value in-house movements, right? And say like, actually an ETA is just as good, if not better. Finger wag, you're wrong for saying you want this. I think your point is like, well, maybe what you really do care about is an in-house movement. And so don't waste your time thinking about things that aren't. And I think this is a good collecting example. I'll give you just like a personal story of mine. Maybe we can wrap on this because it's sort of the moral of the story in some ways. For years, and Asher knows this well, for years, one watch that I really wanted was a Rolex GMT Master 2, a Batman, for years. And I just love that watch.
It's a good watch.
It is. It's not for everyone, but I love that watch. And for years, I told myself, oh, it's going to be too hard to get. I don't want a deal, or it's a lot of money. I don't know that. And it is a lot of money. It's a lot of money. I don't know that I'm ready to spend that on a watch. And what did I do instead? I probably bought like damn near 20 other GMT watches of some variety that were, an approximation of that watch, whether it was a Tudor Black Bay GMT, which is also an awesome watch, but it wasn't perfect for me. I even had a Rolex Explorer 2. I've had other watches that are also rad, but for me, they were just sort of these like stand-ins for what I really wanted. Ultimately, with hindsight being 50-50, and look, watch collecting, as we all say, is a journey, and these lessons are learned the hard way and over time. But, I probably would have saved myself certainly a lot of money if I had just started out by buying the Batman, but maybe I wouldn't have known that I really wanted the Batman if I didn't try those other things first. And so what I really wanted wasn't just a GMT watch. It was that I wanted the Batman. And instead I spent my time pursuing these other GMT watches that weren't really what I fundamentally wanted and wasn't fundamentally happy with. Not that they're not excellent watches, but it just wasn't really what I wanted. And I think the point around the movement things is true and applies here, which is, if you really value an in-house movement, that's okay. This is a hobby. None of these things are required or necessary, and it's all totally subjective. So if that's the thing you want, then maybe move on from evaluating watches that don't quite meet that bar. And, as we've talked about, like those more premium movements or those in-house movements are going to cost more money generally, although there's some great deals to be found out there on the secondary market. But maybe save your bullets and focus your collecting where it really matters to you. And if that's on in-house movements, then great.
I think that's an awesome place to leave it. And as always, we appreciate you listening. So Open Work is a production of Collective Horology. You can find us at collectivehorology.com. To get in touch with suggestions, feedback, or questions, email podcast@collectivehorology.com. And if you'd like to come meet us in person, come by the Wind Up Watch Fair in New York City, October 18, 19, and 20.